Good evening. Thank you for coming this late.
Do you want this?
It's unusual. No, it's for the recording, so it's fine.
Okay.
It's unusual to organize talks this late at Mama, but today was in many ways a Gaza day in Zagreb, with events taking place in Pojas. I guess many of you were upstairs in Privrednik, partaking in what I hear was very intense and divisive debate. Tonight with us we have Toufic Haddad. Toufic is a dear friend. We have had a fortune to work together within a project that my colleagues Marcel Mars and Valeria Graziano have organized with me called Pirate Care. We've had a conference 2018 in Coventry. Well, Marcel and you prior met in Ramallah, and Toufic gave a talk on what it means to provide care in societies where there is fundamentally no system of care, and also then political parties organize various forms of pirate care, sometimes actors that are not necessarily emancipatory or that kind of have ambivalent position, looking at it from sort of westernized perspective. Toufic is a researcher. He holds a PhD from SOAS in developmental studies, but he has worked as a journalist and activist across various parts of the occupied Palestinian territories. Most recently, he has held the position of the director of the Kenyan Institute. That's a branch of Council for British Research in the Levant in Jerusalem, from where he was dismissed after October 7th. In 2016, he has written a book on Palestine Ltd, Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territory, which explored the role of neoliberalism and the World Bank during so-called peace process. Currently, he's working on a book reflecting on the genocide in Gaza and current state of neoliberalism, I guess belligerent neoliberalism, we could call it. I have asked Toufic maybe to reflect, given that we are in the weeks of refugees here in Zagreb, that he maybe reflects on the condition of refugees in Gaza, but also maybe to provide you a more general sense of the situation in Gaza, and he's open also to any questions you might have. So please help me welcome Toufic. And the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Tommy, for that introduction. Thank you, Mama, for hosting me today, and thank you for coming out today, especially after what sounds like to have been quite a long day and an exhausting one, and one that also had to do with the situation in Gaza. Tommy mentioned when I first worked with parts of the Mama Collective or whatever on this project around pirate care, and I was not intending to speak to what I did 5 or 6 years ago, whenever that was, 2018 or 19, in this discussion at all. But if you'd like to look at it, you can find it online, because whatever, they put it online. It's not a self-promotion. What it is, though, is what Tommy was referring to was the fact that I actually did a presentation on the question of group marriages in Gaza in the previous, 15 or 20 years, basically. These were phenomena in Gaza that were where you would witness upwards of 2,000 couples marrying and being married together, part and parcel of the political work of some of the political factions, including Hamas, but also of others, and some of that work around it. Now, so ask anybody on the street, well, I mean, obviously, you know, it's not incumbent upon anyone to know the details of, you know, marriage rituals in any particular context, but all that is to speak to some extent, of the extent to which the Gaza Strip itself is not really a known quantity to many people, including in the Arab world. Okay, there's a lot that's sort of sensationalized about it. There's a lot that's talked about, maybe in sort of political sort of terms or whatnot. But what really goes on in the ground is actually not that well known, and it has distinct attributes to it and its political development and how we got to where we did today. And I guess part of this talk today, especially in the context of where you guys just came from, is an attempt to sort of perhaps go into that and to speak to those aspects in an effort for a dialogue, but also to inform and to sort of speak to especially in the context of this Refugee Week and what's going on in Croatia and more broadly Europe and the world at this stage in history. So that's sort of my brief introduction. I obviously decided to call this talk Gaza Guernica. Guernica, you know, today I'm not so sure to what extent people are aware of Guernica, but Guernica in the Spanish Civil War used to be a sort of a major issue of the left for many reasons. Obviously, one of the chief ways Guernica is remembered is through the Pablo Picasso painting, which basically documents or is a sort of an artistic expression of what was, at the time, a carpet bombing of the town of Guernica in the Basque regions of Spain, which were then held underneath the Republicans by the Franco regime, but really actually the Italian and the German air forces, which came in and used aerial power in 1937 to basically decimate the city. And it was considered one of the sort of a very serious war crime and shocked people because the casualty figures were so high. And obviously Picasso in his own painting was trying to depict not only an anti-war sentiment and one that related to the sort of, you know, civilians in time of war, but it was also pointing to fascism itself and the dangers of fascism. And in a way, also that painting, or replica of the painting, was later on put in the United Nations in building at the General Assembly in New York City, if you're not aware. And part of that also, its inclusion there is not just an anti-war sort of sentiment, but is also about sort of speaking to, by having it in the UN, what happens when you don't do things at the right time, so to speak. And basically the UN was the effort after World War II to come up with means through which, you know, state conflict could be adjudicated or mediated. You know, obviously we have many questions around that, but so by having that painting or replica of that painting in the United Nations, it's sort of acting as a foreboding sort of reminder of the horrors of war, but also you know, the failures of that system and the failures of people at certain times in history, in things they did and things they didn't do. And I think that's partially the message of what I'm trying to get here, because at the end of the day, the question of Guernica and Palestine is not immediately a question of immediate parallels, obviously. Guernica was a civil war which had an international dimension to it, both on the fascist side, but as well as the Republic partisan left progressive side to it. And our conflict today, the question of Gaza today, has many of these dimensions too that I would like to point to as well, that we can also learn about, and I hope to be able to speak to some of those things today and have it be the platform for a discussion, especially amongst comrades in a space like this, and especially in a week which has to do with refugees. And I don't mean that in a cheap manner. I mean that seriously, because going back to the issue of Palestine, Gaza, the question of refugees in the Palestinian context, in Gaza in particular, is so, the hidden history of Gaza as a refugee question is horrific and is atrocious and we are incumbent as moral and historical actors in this age to recognize Gaza as a 7-decade recurrent refugee problem that has continually been a problem. But it's a political question, but it has been dealt with as a question of refugees and humanitarianism, but not a political question, okay? And it has led us to some extent to where we are today. But we can go a little bit more into that question afterwards. But I guess I wanted to start by sort of attempting to provide some background into the question of Gaza itself. Gaza is one of the most important Palestinian historical cities. It is located on the sea, which means that in principle it doesn't actually need Israel, right? It does and could have historical and has had historical relations with the Mediterranean region, okay? It is also at the crossroads of Asia and Africa, which are two key strategic trading routes as well. One that goes up the coast and one that comes from North Africa and also goes towards the interior. So this is sort of an important part of the equation that's not that I'll talked about that much. In addition to that, of course, Gaza was perhaps the only real Palestinian city to survive the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, okay? It is also a territory that has considerable natural gas reserves off its shores, and it is also a territory that is the first non-Egyptian territory to the east of the Suez Canal, the key strategic choke point of global capitalism connecting east and west on a maritime basis, which today remains the main basis of global trade. Okay, and it is not by accident that in this moment of history that as we witness tectonic shifts in geostrategy and imperial power sort of constellations forming and rising and descending, that the central wedge that between supposedly east and west is witnessing increasing turbulence, warfare, conflagration, whether to the north in Ukraine and Russia, these areas, or Palestine itself. And by the way, as you well know, the Balkan region is not far from this, and meaning that it has not been immune to this in the past, and it may not be immune to it in the future. So that's a good start for just sort of attempting to provide a little bit about Gaza's background and history. But I think one of the main issues that I want to talk about are two aspects. One is, several things. Let's talk about Gaza. Gaza, the hidden history of Gaza, its suffering, but also its political role in the Palestinian struggle. Of course, when we talk about Gaza, I'm sorry, before we jump into Gaza, the next part that I want to talk about is actually the international role in the Gaza Strip, the Gaza genocide, what's happening today, and then see if that can be the basis for where we take things further. So that's sort of the basic structure and organization of my talk today. So when we start with Gaza, you have the Gaza city itself, which I mentioned is this large Palestinian city, but the Gaza Strip today is not Gaza City, okay? It is a political territory that is the consequence of the 1948 war, okay? It has no other existence other than its relationship to that war and the armistice lines that were drawn after that war. And in fact, the armistice lines of that war do not represent the borders of Gaza today. The armistice lines initially had it drawn that it was more than 500 kilometers square. Today, Gaza is 360 kilometers square. The difference is that the no man's zone that existed between the initial Gaza and today's Gaza Strip was basically taken over by Israel in the early 1950s, because at the time, the Gaza Strip was basically under the Egyptian king, Farouk, who was a young playboy king backed by the West, who had syphilis and was a kind of like, he ate 600 oysters a week, supposedly, was irrespective. The point is, he did not want to attempt to confront Israel in, basically, after the 1948 war. The residents of the Gaza Strip were no longer the people from the main towns and the city of Gaza, but represented 250 different towns and villages of southern Gaza, southern Palestine and coastal Palestine. Okay, so basically after the ethnic cleansing of between 1947 and 1949, you had 250 villages that were concentrated in the Gaza Strip, which immediately had changed the demographic character of it to the extent that 80% of the population of the Gaza Strip were refugees. This meant that the former elite classes and landholders of the Gaza Strip were the political minority, and that the dominant political character of Gaza as a territory in this condition was one that emphasized return of refugees to their homeland from which they were kicked out. This is an important distinction I raise because when you compare Gaza with the West Bank has around 500 towns and villages in it, okay? It has 18 refugee camps in it, the West Bank, but the refugee population constitutes only roughly about a quarter of the population. So the dominant character, political character, and demand of the West Bank tends to revolve around removal of the occupation and self-determination of the people of the West Bank, as opposed to in Gaza, the political demand revolves around return and refugeehood and is centered around the question of the ethnic cleansing in 1948. It's an important distinction. So Gaza in many ways is the ghost of 1948. It is the memory of what were some of actually the most brutal repression against the Palestinians. There were more than 30 different massacres that took place in Gaza. The British, when they took Gaza, used chemical weapons on it multiple times. The Zionist forces, when they attempted to take Gaza, also attempted to use biological weapons on Gaza. This is all documented, but it is not well known. Okay, and Gaza, even within the broader context of the Palestinian struggle, has always had a kind of junior role to either the diaspora or the West Bank, which was a larger political territory. And there were real reasons why there tended to be the subsuming of Gaza to those larger political dynamics, which we can understand. But with that said, Gaza also operated as the political dynamo of the Palestinian political movement, okay? And in fact, after 1948-49, it became the seat of the All-Palestine government, which was an attempt to actually declare Palestinian statehood and independence and organize it in the pre-PLO period when it was largely a pan-Arab struggle, okay? So that's the early history of Gaza. You also have important other aspects of Gaza that I think are important to keep in mind. You had something known in 1949. There was an Egyptian army battalion was in an area north of Gaza, south of today Jaffa, Tel Aviv, okay, in a place called Fallujah. And there were a cluster of 3 villages called the Fallujah Pocket, which had a large Palestinian population, I believe upwards of 10,000 people at the time, and 4,000 Egyptian soldiers in it. The Egyptian soldiers withdrew. It wasn't the Egyptian soldiers, by the way. It was Farouk who made a deal to surrender and to pull the Egyptian army out on the basis that the Palestinians in these territories would remain in place. Okay, would have rights to live in what became the future Israel. That happened, the Egyptians pulled out. By the early 50s, 1953, all Palestinians in these areas had been kicked out as well to the Gaza Strip. In fact, it was those memories that led to not just radicalization inside Gaza, which Gaza didn't need a reason to radicalize, but that led the Egyptian officers who were in the Fallujah pocket, including Abdel Nasser himself, to eventually lead the Young Officers' Rebellion in 1954 and to kick out Farouk. Okay? So an important part of the history there. Second, the next major political dynamic that was happening was these refugees, you didn't have consolidated borders. You had loose borders, an armistice line. And the Palestinians were attempting to go back to their homes. And this led to a period in the early 50s, basically, of what Benny Morris, the Israeli Zionist historian, basically wrote a whole book about called the border wars. Okay? Basically, refugees are trying to go back, and the Israelis didn't want any refugees back, so they just shot them. Okay? To confront this, the Israelis initially developed an attempt to, they needed to document they needed to monitor and potentially push back this sort of wave of Gazan refugees who were trying to come in. So you had actually the Zionist labor movements going down and establishing agricultural settlements and kibbutzim with a military agricultural joint role in specifically the areas that were between the current day border and the initial border, okay? And they became known as Nahal settlements, okay? And in fact, this largely became the area where the Hamas attack on October 7th entered, okay? The point here is Israel lacked strategic military depth as a small country. It feared an Egyptian army, the largest and strongest Egyptian army, coming in from the south and separating and splitting Israel, okay? So connecting with the West Bank, etc., and taking, for instance, so they supported the construction of Nahal settlements. However, at a certain point, they recognized that these civilian military settlements were not going to be an adequate obstacle to preventing a real army coming in. Just a bunch of kibbutzniks who were, with some guns and a watchtower and some sort of Zionist ideology are not going to stop an army coming in. So Israel actually changes its mentality of military strategy and opts for what it calls then and today the politics of deterrence. What is deterrence? Deterrence is to create fear and inside the enemy, the Palestinians and the Arabs, to make them fear that don't fuck with Israel. We are a mad dog. We will kill you. We will horrify you. And that logic will be internalized by our enemies, and eventually they'll get the message. Dayan has his own version of it. He calls it the mad dog theory, but it's formalized in the 50s. And what it's formalized around is around a proactive policy where defense and offense become one, okay? And this is actually the era where Sharon is key in developing this. And right next to Gaza, a few kilometers out from it, today it's called the Black Arrow Monument for Israeli paratroopers who, when they developed the policy of deterrence and paramilitary strike forces and elite forces into Gaza, those who died in those raids. And there were many raids. In fact, there were 70 different raids which are commemorated from 1953 until 1956 on the Black Arrow Monument, which is 2 or 3 kilometers from North Gaza today. Okay? So the policy, Israel's strike first, ask questions later, horrify, etc., that comes from Gaza. Okay. By the way, in this period too, there are also fairly well documented cases of butchery as well as mass rape, which are not well known, but are also documented by Zionist historians. And Ben Gurion himself wrote about it, that it was a problem. But whatever, it was there. Okay. So that's another hidden history. Next part of it. In 1956, Israel, allying itself with France and Britain, attempted to sort of look, Israel was always this sort of colonial outpost. We know this, but Britain and France had taken a hit in the war, and their empires were down. There was an effort in 56 through Israel when Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, and they go after Egypt. But when they go after Egypt, they go through Gaza. And in 1956, most of the time, they rolled over Gaza, but in Khan Yunis in particular, the southern city, main southern city, they committed one of the worst massacres in historical Palestine, which basically looked like Israeli stormtroops. It was done by the labor movement generals too, Mati Peled, who went into Gaza and into Khan Yunis, and they pulled out the men from the refugee camps and lined them up in walls and shot them. It was an old school massacre technique, okay? Up until October 7th, this was the largest historical massacre to take place in Palestine, okay? And by the way, the main political leadership and military leadership of Hamas, who engaged in October 7th, all of them, almost all of them, Mohammed Deif, Mohammed Sinwar, and Yahya Sinwar, and Shabbani, all of them come from families who were victims of Khan Yunis 1956 and Rafah 1956, because they committed a smaller massacre, 250 people also in Rafah, shooting them, collecting them in and shooting them in this way. Okay, another hidden history of Gaza. And the key founders of Hamas, by the way, not Sinwar and those guys are the next generation, but there was a generation before them, all spoke to the Khan Yunis massacre, including Abdulaziz Rantisi, one of the main founders of the movement. He said, that is where I learned to hate. In 1967, of course, whatever, I'm going to jump over history. It's a small room and it's a lot to go over, and I'm not going to try and give you the whole damn history of Gaza. But in 1967, of course, in 56, Eisenhower forces the Israelis to give back Gaza. It's an important point, okay, because he recognized that basically no more Euro imperialism in this region. We are top dogs, and you can't turn the tides of history back. So an American president pushed back the Israelis out of Gaza. And then in 1967, we have 67 war again, and Israel takes what we know, the West Bank, Golan Heights, Gaza, and Sinai again, okay? This time, Israel was going to hold on to the territories, right? And use its holding of the Sinai Peninsula as a kind of bargaining chip with the Egyptians to get them out of the struggle. And then Gaza, they needed to figure out what they were going to do with it. But people don't know that in 1967, the Israelis, there is an entire refugee camp today located in North Jordan called Jarash Camp, which is composed of 12,000 people who are Gazans who were pushed out of Gaza, and they facilitated their basically ethnic cleansing to Jordan. Okay? So entire camp today, they're all Gazan residents, or they're multiple-time refugees. Okay? In 1969 and 70, there was also a major political uprising in Gaza, in the camps. And there even is, it's a bit of a legendary period for Palestinians, because it talks about, it's the period of what they call Gaza, Jivara Gaza, okay? There was this saying that Sharon runs Gaza by day, Jivara Gaza runs it by night, okay? Because this was the early efforts of guerrilla activity affiliated with the PLO, but also basically a refugee militancy, to start attacking the Israeli positions in and around Gaza, of the new occupied territory of Gaza, basically. Eventually, this was put down, and the Israelis not only bulldozed huge sections of the Gaza Strip and of the camps, because they were seen as large, dense ghettos, basically, and what he did was he took bulldozers and he created huge highways in between to be able to cut up the refugees, to be able to accessed the camp and put down the rebellion in easier ways, okay? But he also took 10,000 refugees, at least, and kicked them where? To the Sinai, okay? This years later would be to Al Arish, which is sort of the first Egyptian town on the coast, not that far from Rafah, okay? This had its own political contradictions to it, but it's also not widely recognized today. Of course, Gaza would later be the seat and the starting point of the first Intifada. It starts in Jabalia refugee camp. Of course, it would also be the hottest zone in the second Intifada. So all this speaks to sort of an incredible amount of suffering, repeated ignoring of the cause. When I talked about refugees, it's quite important here to mention, but Gaza was the ultimate refugee question. But what people don't realize is sort of the United Nations develops its policies around refugees based on what happens in World War II, basically. The idea, most refugees were white refugees in their opinion, okay? And because of the feeling that the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem was partly because of the UN partition plan, okay, of 1947. The partition plan created the basis for the legitimate idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. When the United Nations legitimized that state, the first thing the Zionists did was to start pushing out the non-Jews from those areas, because the non-Jews in those areas were at least 50%. And there was no way that it could actually really be a Jewish state. Jewish landholdings were 7% of the territory. In the future Jewish state under the November 29th, 1947 partition plan, the Jewish state would have been 50-50 Jewish-Arab. So the non-Jews needed to be kicked out if the Jewish state idea was to be legitimate, to be allowed to happen. This basically created the basis for the expulsion in 48, and those are the first areas they went for. And the end result was Gaza. As an act of attempting to go through this history, the United Nations said, look, we are going to create two regimes to protect refugee rights because this case is so particular and we are so responsible for it. So they created the UNCCP, which is the United Nations Conciliation Commission on Palestine, and they created UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, not association, agency. UNRWA was supposed to provide for housing, social needs, medical needs, food distribution, pure humanitarian survival aspects, tents. It was tents. That's literally what it was. That's the agency, okay. UNCCP was intended to be the body that would represent the political rights of the refugees as refugees, as part of the UN system of peoples who are entitled to the rights of other refugees, which is the right to return, to compensation, to restitution, etc. Okay? Because the Arab-Israeli conflict was frozen in the 1950s, UNCCP stopped working on its political mandate to actually push forward political return, transformed its mandate into the registration of refugee property. Until today, the UNCCP is the largest registration of more than 400,000 index cards documenting Palestinian refugee property. And then that stopped. That initiative stopped and is frozen. It was in Austria for a while. I think it's in New York, or I'm not really sure. But it is a beautiful archive of what Palestine was and what individual Palestinians lost, but it has never done anything more than that, okay? UNRWA continued as a political agency because the refugee problem, so to speak, still remained. And you had millions of Palestinian refugees, the official ones that are upwards of 5.5 million, but maybe well more than that, up to 10 million people. Okay, so we're talking about, but not all refugees were registered. It's a big question. But the point is, UNRWA, because of this irony of history, which I just described, its continued existence reminded the world and reminds the world of what happened in 48, UN responsibility, right of refugees to return, etc. And today, it is the body that they are working to basically get rid of. For years, though, by the way, it was the Americans, and of course the Europeans, which ensured the survival of UNRWA. Not because they were interested in keeping alive the question of Palestinian refugees and their right to return, but because UNRWA was operating in camps, in countries like Jordan, which were seen as key strategic to supporting the Jordanian regime. And that if you took away this funding and took away this political question and released all these angry, aggrieved refugees who had been ignored, suppressed, and whatnot, and beaten up for the last 40, 50, 60 years, that it would lead to destabilization of the entire region, and including their allies. So they maintained UNRWA's being alive. Today, under Trump, and the pyromaniac politics that have taken over, there's an idea that no, actually now we actually have to get rid of UNRWA, okay? Which is speaking about how crazy things have sort of gone even in their own worldview and thinking. So that's a little bit about Gaza and sort of its history that I think hasn't really been recognized, but are sort of speak to a lot of sort of important things that are worth looking into, that are part of the equation, that are not, aren't really talked about when Gaza gets talked about in its sensationalized version today. The other side of the question that I'd really like to talk about is really the question of the international aspects of, international responsibility around what's happening today. Okay. Now, there's a lot to say here, of course, but and I do want to not just leave that whole history that I mentioned about Gaza stopping at the Second Intifada, but I'm going to use the more modern history now to talk about it in the context of the international context. But before we get to the contemporary, I do want to say it's incumbent upon me, because partly what I'm trying to do here is saying, look, there is an international role here in this whole thing. And it's not just America gives $1 and it ends up in a bullet in Gaza, okay? It's something much larger. My story about Gaza has already brought the history back to 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel and Zionism. And in necessity, today, the genocide today also needs to bring back and open up this question. That's what's going on here, okay? So we need to start any serious attempt to assess the Gaza genocide today needs to look at Israel, needs to look at its driving ideology of Zionism, its links to imperial powers, its praxis as a settler colonial entity, but also its ideological dimensions as an attempt to establish a Jewish democratic state in the land of Palestine, historical Palestine. Here it's important to identify that the Zionist variant ideology was part of a larger spectrum of ideas around how to organize societies and how to solve the question of the Jewish question. The Jewish question was a larger historical, largely European question, but had to do with very real questions of anti-Semitism, and particularly the rise of nationalism, the question around who was in and out of the nation, where those borders would be, and where Jews fit in. So basically from 1882 onwards, you had 5 million Central and European Jews fleeing these areas because in the collapse of the ex-Tsarist rule and the crisis of those systems, Jews were used as scapegoats for the failures of the Tsarism and these larger national questions that were being played. Zionism was one of the potential answers. Socialism was another, and an inclusive citizenship based on equality and rights for all was actually the dominant political ideology amongst European Jewry, and this is where you get the idea that Jews were responsible for socialism, etc., that you find, whatever. And this is also why you have Western European countries, as including not just the United States, but also Britain, and Lord Arthur Balfour, who himself, Balfour, was the parliamentarian who wrote the Penal Act of 1905, which prevented Jewish immigration to the UK. So instead of allowing Jews who were fleeing the pogroms and the Cossacks and the mass rape and the burning of villages in Eastern Europe and Russia, instead of allowing those people to come to England, where some of them wanted to, or to get to the New World, North America, South America, or whatnot, he said, no, let's get them eventually to Palestine and envelop this in a project that has to do with taking over the leftover of the ex-Ottoman Empire. Now, obviously, I'm being a bit, but I have to give a short version of history here. But I will not talk about the genocide without talking about the nature of Israel and Zionism and Western responsibilities in allowing for what fundamentally was a reactionary solution to the Jewish question. It was basically saying, look, the answer to anti-Semitism is that Jews must have their own state, they must be proud and strong, and they also must be settlers and colonizers. And that was not a question thing. Britain said we wanted them to be colonizers. The the World Zionist organizations, the Zionist organizations pushing it were very clear that it was a colonial project. They understood that there was no attempt to integrate with Palestinians. It was all about establishing Jewish labor, Jewish settlement, etc. And the question was how to do that so it worked, so that a serf from Poland or Ukraine would have an interest to come into Palestine and to live there. And it was only until the left, the Zionist left, developed the model of the Moshavim, whereupon Israel became a viable idea for that kind of disenfranchised Jewish immigrant who was fleeing his context, because it created shared interests and a stake for them. You understand? So basically, it's an important part of it. It was left Zionism which created this collectivist model that allowed for the previous Zionist models, and the two previous major waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine failed, and Jews left. They wanted to go to North and South America. Less than 1% of the 5 million comes to Palestine between 1882 and 1915. They weren't interested in going to the backwater of the Ottoman Empire, okay? Until the left comes up with the model, look, we'll give you... The previous model was that Rothschild would be, and wealthy Jews in Western Europe would be the landholders, and they'll come and they'll work on my big farm on the coast, an orange farm, which was not appealing to Jews. They had left serfdom in Ukraine and Poland, and they weren't interested in establishing another version of serfdom in Palestine under the British or a wealthy Jew. So that's also kind of important. All this to say that Zionism still offered was an attempted reactionary solution that the West used because it served colonial purposes, and because they also didn't want to address their own anti-Semitic questions. They wanted to pocket their nationalist endeavors, which basically eliminated their minorities in many contexts, and to basically export the problem into a forward position in the ex-Ottoman Empire. That's basically what happened. And Israel and the Zionists recognized that role, that they were to play this role in this frontier region to basically be what today the Americans have sometimes called the largest aircraft carrier in the Middle East that cannot be sunk. In the early days of the state, it was supposed to be a British and French imperial outpost. Today, it is an American one. And of course, after 1967, Israel proved in destroying the Pan-Arab nationalist movement of Abdel Nasser that it could do a major service to Western imperialism by cracking that initiative and defeating Nasser, what they called defanging Nasser. Because at the end of the day, you still had 300 to 400 Muslims in North Africa and the Levant area who actually also had a lot of gas and oil and had a lot of had nationalist ideas. And if that was able to organize in a primitive national body, it would threaten Western interests in the region. So Zionism could serve an important role in that regard. Of course, America becomes the main backer of this state. And this is after 1967, you see the amount of money that come into it and the weapons that go into it go much higher. What you begin to see, though, however, is because in 1967, Israel took over, because of the memory of 1948, and because Palestinians largely remained in the territories which Israel occupied, Israel was confronted with this dilemma. The dilemma of how to maintain a Jewish democratic state while occupying and controlling a large Jewish, non-Jewish population that had the potential to actually demographically overcome the number of Jews. So this dilemma Israel always posed itself as a Jewish democratic state, but the democratic character of Israel was not intended and never intended to allow or recognize equal rights for non-Jews. They could tolerate a minority amount of non-Jews in the Jewish state, but the democratic character of Israel was to mediate intra-Jewish issues, because fundamentally the project of allowing Jews from Ukraine and Poland and Iraq and Morocco and America and Australia to come in and be settlers in Palestine today was not a natural idea. It was also based on biblical mythologies that in the end could not be scientifically even backed up. So democracy was an important mediating factor for intra-Jewish disputes, but was not supposed to be generalized to non-Jews. When they took over this large Palestinian population, the dilemma began to brew. And from 1967 until 1987, Israel was directly occupying this population. Palestinians were looking towards their diasporic PLO movement, which was based in Lebanon or Jordan and later Tunisia, for the political leadership to bring about their rights. But when it became obvious that that was not going to happen, you had the first Intifada brewing. This exposed the contradiction, the dilemma of direct occupation. Direct occupation for Israel and convergence between Palestinian society and Israeli society in the post-67 context. You understand? After 1967, Israel pulled down all the borders, allowed Palestinian labor to enter Israeli cities and workspaces, worked and took money in shekels, learned Hebrew, built houses, built universities. It was leading to a process of convergence between the two parts. This was a problem for the Jewish state. To maintain a Jewish state, you need Jewish majoritarianism. So and especially when the Intifada begins, the need to separate from the Palestinians arose. And the largest separation needed to happen where? With Gaza. Because Gaza had never had any serious development taking place in it. It was 8 major refugee camps, 80% refugees. That was the perfect, exploitable, working community which was filling the Israeli service sector in Tel Aviv and the rest of the country. All the chefs, all the people who worked in the hotels, the garbage men, the supermarket people, they were all Gazans, okay? Gaza was known as a ghetto, a place you go and next to the beach, you smoke weed, and buy cheap weed there, and then you go and you work during the week in Tel Aviv. And by the way, if you went to Gaza, they actually had the best food there because they were all working in these 5-star hotels in Tel Aviv. So, in any respect, the need to separate from Gaza was big. And that's because that's also where the First Intifada was the strongest, okay? And so Rabin used to say, I wish I woke up and Gaza had sunk into the sea. He also said, we need to get Gaza out of Tel Aviv. Point. That was the main impetus behind the peace process, okay? The peace process from an American-Israeli perspective was to facilitate Israeli-Palestinian separation, okay? It was argued to be in the context of a potential two-state solution. There is no evidence from an American perspective or from an Israeli perspective that there was any interest to recognize Palestinian national rights. Separation, yes. National rights, no. And in fact, the Israeli plan around separation was called the Alon Plan. It was known to be an autonomy plan. Autonomy being providing certain services and certain aspects of life, housing, schools and healthcare and roads. Give that to the Palestinians. We don't want to have to deal with that stuff. It's expensive, it's endless, it's just a refugee ghetto. What do we have to do with it? And give that to the Palestinians. Find somebody to deal with that. It's not enough just to have UNRWA do it. And get them off our demographic books, get them off our political books. You understand? Because there was also beginning to be some political work between Palestinian factions and Israeli left individuals, and not really factions, but individuals. But there were even some factions, Meretz Party and stuff like that. You begin to see some sort of crossover. In any respect, the peace process was really about this separation, implementing what was known as the Alon Plan, an autonomy plan, which basically enabled for this separation to happen. And this is where the real international position, role and responsibility comes out today. Because from 1993 to today, what is that, 32 years or whatever, forget the last 2 years, let's say whatever, you had upwards of 50 billion US dollars that came out of your tax money and Western tax money, pumped into a supposed peace process that was not intended to secure peace, but was intended to result in separation, okay? And at the end of that 30 years, you actually had every international human rights organization in the world basically recognized the context as one of apartheid. They were forced to, Amnesty International, Human Rights International, from the river to the sea, because nothing was changing. What was changing was, you still had 14 million Palestinians and Israelis between the river and the sea, but what you had was now, at the end of it, 156 different Palestinian islands in the West Bank and Gaza, surrounded by Israeli settlements and Israeli contiguity, not Palestinian contiguity in these areas. So you see, they were creating a Swiss cheese state because it was unifying and Israel and allowing for the integration of conquests of 48 and 67, and Palestinians were turning into islands. And in that view, Gaza was the largest island to be created. Even though the West Bank was the much larger territory, and everyone thinks that's and it is what the Israelis want, but the largest little island in the West Bank territorially is Tubas, which most of you guys probably have never even heard of. It's like an agricultural area. And demographically would probably be Nablus or Hebron, which has 350,000 people, a tenth the size of Gaza, a tenth. So the political mass and momentum of the Palestinian movement and shifted to Gaza, okay? Even though the political leadership of the historical movement, the PLO, parks itself in the West Bank, in Ramallah, close to Jerusalem, okay, but not in Jerusalem, okay? And it becomes the recipient of this $50 billion in aid. It dominates the economic and political opportunities. It puts its people in place. It sets up the companies. It sets up the self-administration. But it's not doing anything against Israel. It's not achieving the larger rights. It's being seen as becoming much more of a kind of subcontractor, a self-benefacting power, etc. And eventually, after the whole thing explodes in the Second Intifada, when finally Palestinians go to elections in 2005, and I'm jumping over a large history here, and when Hamas wins power, basically the internationals don't really recognize that it's a real election and that Hamas's victory in it. So basically, a divide and rule logic emerges. They continue to fund Fatah in the West Bank, don't allow Hamas to take over and occupy the institutions and animate the institutions of the Palestinian Authority. This basically means that the Palestinian Authority was supposed to be a subservient collaborationist entity that would service an apartheid model and the economics of that model and the service-related elements, but would get rid of the rights-based elements of it. All that responsibility gets shifted to Gaza, gets shifted to Hamas in a context of siege, etc. And the siege basically begins to last for 17 years, where basically Gaza becomes this open-air, toxic prison with no water, with no control, with no movement, with no economy, and it creates the explosive conditions which lead to October 7th. What am I saying here when we talk about internationals and all that little thing that I just mentioned? What I'm saying is it was international aid and the peace process that created apartheid, which created the basis of the genocide today. Okay? My book is about the World Bank, which was the chief policy thinker. It wasn't really the money. The money was coming from the European individual states, but it was going through World Bank policy within this larger structure of what I kind of an autonomy arrangement to enact separation, which fundamentally was an establishment of apartheid. Okay? And that without that process, the genocide would not have been possible. So the genocide has a lot of international culpability in it, from the denial of historical rights of Palestinians and Palestinian refugees to its blindness around the reactionary nature and of Israel as a settler colony, etc., to non-implementation of political rights of Palestinians and sort of using the terror excuse for years, to the support of the peace process, to the denial of Palestinian democracy and the Palestinian Authority, to fundamentally later on, of course, the empowering of Israel in the peace process to solve its Palestine problem by getting them off the books. They were still there, but they were just now somehow administratively written in a new way, and allow Israel to get out of it, and to allow for Israel to globalize itself after the peace process, to clean its image, because Israel was well known in the 80s, in the first Intifada, as basically being the sister project of apartheid South Africa, okay? And it was well known, and everybody knew it, etc. Now no one talks about it. No one remembers, like no one remembers Spain, no one remembers South Africa, what apartheid was about, and the horror of apartheid. The internationals developed apartheid in Palestine. They built it, and then they cleansed Israel from the scourge of those policies, and said that they were peacemakers, basically. And so, and this enabled Israel to internationalize, to access China, India, Japan, Korea, to take its products around. Israel de facto becomes the research and development headquarters of Western capitalism. When gas is discovered in Eastern Mediterranean, it is also seen as a source to diversify European energy reliance upon Russia and those areas and to diversify it. Germany gives nuclear submarines to Israel in the early 2000s because it knows that it wants it to be the policeman of the Eastern Mediterranean, and that still seafaring traffic is still the most important traffic, and you need to have a top dog in the region. So when October 7th happened, and when we see the Americans give $30 billion in a year and a half, billion in a year and a half in weaponry, the top-notch weaponry, and we see the European powers, hard and soft, hard institutions, soft institutions, all equivocating around this genocide, accepting narratives that are not evidentially based around October 7th, going towards the whole terrorism thing, etc., 9/11, etc. I mean, there's a lot to say about what happened in October 7th, but what Israel was doing was something fundamentally different than a defense act against Hamas or whatever, and that's pretty obvious today. When you kill 54,000 people in minimum, that's bodies that we can see, and when 2/3 of them are women and children, something, and it happens again and again and again and again, something else is going on here. Okay, and Israel has, by the way, has made no secret about what it's doing and its intentions and whatnot to eliminate the ghost of 48 and to eliminate Gaza as the incubator and the nucleus and the contiguity of Palestinian revolutionary experience, mentality, politics, and to break that. Because if it breaks that, then it can continue into the West Bank and potentially into Israel. Maybe not immediately, but it depends. There's always debates about how fast, where you want to, when and where, but Gaza needs to be broken first. Now, that's basically what I wanted to say today, okay? Give you that background. It's not over. What we do today matters. They are in crisis. They're very good at killing people, that's pretty obvious, but they are in fundamental dilemmas. Direct occupation failed from 1967 to 1987 or even 1993. That was the model of occupation. Indirect occupation, apartheid, also failed. It resulted in this situation. And now the only solution they have is genocide or ethnic cleansing. That is what they are posing to us. And that's what they're saying it's about. And there's differences about timing, how, when, etc. But that's fundamentally that they are politically and militarily bankrupt and have gone to this level. And we must be aware of this and internalize the seriousness of it, but then also begin to internalize what our responsibility becomes within this context. This becomes a question for political actors themselves, of moral and political conscience in this day and age. The architecture of facilitation, powers, institutions that support the genocide is diverse and wide. And clearly it is the Western umbrella that is making this possible. But the entire Western umbrella is not the same, of course. And I'm speaking to a crowd in Croatia and Zagreb today, which will occupy a very particular corner of this. It is your responsibility, and it is peoples of conscious responsibility, wherever they occupy, to study this history, to study where and how aspects of this fit into the logic, direct or indirect, the actions that we take and the passivity, the actions we don't take, which enable the genocide to be perpetuated or not to be stopped. Here I would also caution, it is not a question of providing aid to Gazans, right? It's not, they're trying to pose this idea of basically a humanitarian genocide. We're going to make sure that we get packages to Gaza, but we're also going to make sure that they're kicked out to Jordan and Egypt and then 200-300 of them are killed every day. Like, what's going on? You know, so the absurdity, the disgrace of what Gaza is today is a challenge, an intellectual, a political, and a moral challenge for everybody in this room and everyone in the world. And it is incumbent upon us to understand how and where what we can do about it. Because like Guernica, back in the Spanish Civil War was a prelude to World War II. Was a prelude to World War II. What is happening in Gaza today may also be a prelude to a real full-blown World War III that comes back when you unleash the fascism, the populism, the militarism, the military techniques of what we have seen in Gaza, and imagine it not being employed just against Gazans and Muslims and refugees and terrorists, but being employed against your neighbors in Croatia or who knows where else. Maybe that also should be part of what we think, let alone the fact that we should stand up for what's right from the very beginning, not just out of self-interest. So I guess I'll end there, and hopefully that's the basis to talk about more later on. So thank you.
I'm sure there are questions both related to this deep dive into political history and geography of Gaza, but also deep dive into a long history of international involvement and build-up of present-day genocide. But yeah, they can also be, I guess, on any other points of interest that you might have related to the present situation in Gaza or geopolitical context. Stephen.
Thank you for the very intense and very, I think, justifiedly intense and very, but also in terms of information, very rich presentation of these aspects of the history of Gaza, which most, even people who have read some of the standard historiographies are not aware of. I wasn't aware of many of these things. But since you emphasize the geopolitical dimension, and there is of course one of the famous statements when there was this British mandate, and when people like Herzl were basically, or even earlier, but people like Herzl were trying to sell the idea of a Zionist project in Palestine to the West, to Western imperial powers. They were explicitly saying we would be an outpost of European civilization, a sea of barbarians, and blah blah blah. And later on, after the establishment of the British mandate, there was of course this famous phrase, I don't know which politician it was, who explicitly said, a little loyal Jewish Ulster is what we need in this region. So that aspect, and okay, you also emphasized now, of course, the continuities with American politics. But then the question becomes, from this, for me at least, in this geostrategic framing, for the Americans, isn't it a risk also that this endgame scenario, either ethnic cleansing or genocide, and this is like not like a genocide you can hide, is like the Armenian genocide or something, with selfies and social media, everyone is confronted with these pictures, whether you want to or not. Isn't there a risk that this could, in some sense, become a boomerang or backfire? We already see with the activities in Yemen, with the Houthis, which basically were already attacking a very important, or blocking a very important maritime route for global capital. Isn't there a risk that this could backfire? And also, despite the fact that Saudis and most of Arab actors in the region seem to have abandoned the Palestinian question, but the populations have not, and so this could also be a pressure cooker. So isn't there, not under Trump, but isn't this basically what makes it, this potentially counterproductive, at least from an American imperialist perspective, to let the mad dog really, play out his end game?
Thank you for the question, and I would agree with you. It has boomeranged, and they don't know what to do about it. And it's an important point. But that's only by virtue of the fact that there has been a major pushback. And a major pushback means the people of Gaza have remained steadfast. They remain resistant, and there's a large international, block of solidarity that is building and growing and exposing, and the old means of mystification and confusion and putting people down don't exist. So it's an important point because it's a testament to the fact that I don't want to say we're winning, because no one can say that you win in a genocide when a genocide is basically already it's a question of how long is this genocide going to go on for and whether it's going to be completed or not, right? I mean, correct? I mean, that's basically what the question is. But I will also agree that basically they don't know what to do. And they are floundering, we say. When Trump stands up and says, yeah, we're going to create Gaza Riviera, you can't pull a fucking idea like out of your ass like that and think it's going to, like a rabbit, like it's going to solve the problem. The Israelis are like, what? It also is a kind of testament to the fact that, what was wrong with Israel is an ineffective colonial power in being able to manage this colonial situation. And even though it's slaughtering, it's still not working enough. So Trump has to come up with his idea, okay, we're going to do it, or we're going to, whatever. Of course, he'll take the political legitimacy that an ethnic cleansing needs to happen for a Gaza Riviera to happen, but he's not happy about that, even an American president coming up with an idea that we'll create an American-administered Gaza. He knows it's all nonsense. It's not going to go anywhere and whatever. But it also speaks to a crisis amongst them. And Trump himself is no deep geostrategic thinker. That's pretty obvious. He's transactional. He's a vulture capitalist. He thinks, he doesn't understand nationalism. He doesn't understand history. He doesn't read books or whatever. And he doesn't trust anybody either. And he relies upon sycophants and narcissism. And it's obvious that there is a dangerous, toxic cocktail of masculinity and idiocy and fascism all combined in one, in this overpowerful American empire that's empowered with, super huge, whatever, but cluster bombs or bombs and also super amounts of intelligence, but is also in a period of decline, right? And with the ascent of other powers. And of course, what you were mentioning is very important. I mean, their whole plan to shut down China and to consolidate a unipolar American Western hegemony for not just 30 years, which we just had, but 300 years, was the India-Israel connection that Biden announced, basically. So basically, to reorganize the Middle East area, we can keep the Chinese at bay by basically the Indians now. They're smart enough. There are more of them now than the Chinese. And they are going to be our Eastern sort of partner in there. They're going to sort of win out, and make the Chinese pay, whatever. And then we'll bring in Gulf capital, and Israel will be the spigot to feed Europe. And khalas, the story is over, game over from their perspective. And then October happened. Then Palestine, so it was a bone in the throat of this imperial project that they didn't realize how big it was, and and the real key about it was the mad dog idea. The logic works if you do get deterred, right? You need the other side to say, shit, wow, that's a mad fucking dog. I'm not going to touch that thing, But Gazans didn't do that. That's the important point here. And in fact, the longer it lasts, the longer Gazans, but okay, I don't want to romanticize Gazans. They're trying to survive, but they're also putting up a struggle, right? And then the longer that it doesn't collapse, the longer there is no solution, and the Israelis take hits, and Israeli society is more and more divided, and the captives are not returned, and Israel doesn't have a clean solution to it. the longer the mad dog doesn't work. And actually then Israel really does become a problem to Western capitalism. Because it's like all of a sudden, now you see the Western bourgeoisie organizing and say, what the fuck, okay. You want me to pay for your genocide indefinitely when you have Beni Gvir and Smotrich talking about greater Israel, talking about drowning prisoners, talking about raping people. That's not the order that they are products of their populist, fascistic manosphere, who knows what the hell they are. But that's not Western Europe and post-war liberal order, which was a very effective way to create some form of social and political stability for the last 70 years, right? I mean, it was not without its problems, whatever, and I'm not, whatever, I'm a socialist, so I don't, but it still was very effective. You can't question it. So that's why because now 20, 21, 22 months after this thing, and they held on, now the tide is shifted. And now the ruling classes in Western Europe says, look, they're exposing their discomfort with the situation. They're not going to allow. Historically, the relationship was with Israel as a state and with Israel as an army. As an army, the relationship was with the army and largely with the labor movement. When it came to the Likud and that wing of Israeli Zionism, there was never really full, Western Europe was never fully happy about it because they knew that had direct roots and direct connections with Jewish supremacy, fascism, and the fascism in Europe. They knew it. They knew it from the very beginning. So that wasn't the only, whatever. Some of them, the Western Europe had its own fascism as well, whatever. We're not going to talk about denazification in Germany or whatever, or what, a relationship between Ford and Nazism or whatever, right? But actually what you see today is, whole forms of Western capital that actually do have potential interests in this fascistic idea and aren't interested in liberal democracy in any sense. They think democracy is slow and stupid and useless, when we're so smart and we can build the thing that can go to Mars. And that's sort of how these people, there's something really scary that's going on in terms of that side of the equation. But fundamentally, the historical relationship was with the army. Today, the relationship is not even with the state, nor with the army. It's not even with the Likud, it's with part of the Likud because it's Netanyahu's Likud. He keeps on kicking out parts of the Likud that he doesn't like, and they form other parties that are in opposition to him on a personalist basis. And, Netanyahu's Likud plus his band of cuckoo fascist brothers, basically. And the marginalized within Israeli society, basically. The Orthodox, both the Haredim, the Ashkenazi one, and the Arab one, the hard right, the settlers, and that's his coalition. They used to call that the second Israel. Israel, the Ashkenazi Israel, was the beautiful Israel. It was the product of, we know what that was. That was the mythology that allowed Israel to have so much sway both for decades. But today we see the second Israel, and Netanyahu has been able to basically align a coalition of the second Israel that is stable and demographically big enough to maybe displace the Ashkenazi. So even if Netanyahu loses his coalition, don't be surprised if they go to elections and he wins again. Okay? Because because in that, the weird project of Israel as the settler colonial state, who are trying to figure out how they're going to divide the pie of Palestine amongst themselves, Palestinians are out, and more the Ashkenazi labor Zionists will also be out, and with their Western passports will also begin to out-migrate, and who will be left will be him and his people, etc. And Western Europe, Western bourgeoisie is not necessarily fully comfortable with that. So we need to continue. You see, those are the dynamics that are at play. And we need to play upon those contradictions, I would say, and those weaknesses, and you know, not give up the fight, expose them, go after each institution and each area, power map every single aspect of where we can find culpability and facilitation of the Zionist project, be it hard, soft, materially, etc. And that's what we need to do in this project, basically, and to meld that project with the larger progressive struggles in our societies for progressive Croatia or United States or Western whatever, you know. And in that regard, also, I would argue that we need to sort of, you know, learn lessons in a way that sort of the Spanish Revolution and what happened in Spain in the 30s also forgot. Because Spanish partisans, for instance, Spain was still actually a colonial power at the time in Morocco. And Spanish partisans, even though sections of them were supported Moroccan independence, the Republic didn't actually push that forward. And so there was a blindness there. So the Eurocentric left, and you know, needs to evolve, needs to use Palestine as a tool and a mechanism of its own education and of its own political mobilization to prevent the present and the future horrors that are promised by the unleashing of what we see in the Gaza genocide. Franco was a military officer in Morocco. Germany, Hitler studied American Indian decimation and then had the experience of the Herero in Namibia. So Aimé Césaire speaks of this sort of boomerang effect of what the Holocaust was taking the horrors that had been inflicted partially on the colonial people and bringing it back in the homeland, in Europe. Who knows what that means today? I don't even want to ask that question. I don't need to go there because I see what is happening in Gaza today. And that is enough, and we should learn the lessons of history to know that that's enough to mobilize to stop it today. So, yeah.